Good morning everyone, my name is Michelle. I hope you're doing well and welcome to episode 8 of Crime Stories Sunday. In this episode we're going to look at the shocking double murder of Mary Bell, who murdered a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old in May and July 1968. The shocking thing about this case is that Mary was only 11 years old. She was 11 when she committed the murders and 11 when convicted of their manslaughter. What I want to do today is tell you Mary's story. Mary Flora Bell was born on the 26th of May 1957. Her mother, Elizabeth, known as Betty, was a well-known prostitute in the local area who was often absent from the home due to her job, and she used to travel to meet clients as far as Glasgow in Scotland. Mary lived in the northeast of England, Newcastle on Tyne, and that is fairly close to the Scottish border. But still, Betty's absence was felt in Mary's life, because when Betty was absent, Mary was left in the care of her father. Now, there is some controversy as to whether Mary's father was her biological father, but I think probably for the sake of this story, it doesn't matter, because it was William Bell, known as Billy, who looked after her when he was present, because he too was often absent. He was an alcoholic and alcohol made him violent. He was an habitual criminal who specialised in armed robbery. So he'd done his fair share of criminal activities. So Mary really, had such a terrible start in life. She was actually born when Betty was only 17. And according to one of her aunts, within minutes of Mary's birth, her mother had resented Mary's presence and told hospital staff, "Take this thing away from me." Why she didn't have Mary adopted, I don't know, because as Mary grew, members of the family did want to take over Mary's care, and Betty always refused. But as a baby, a toddler, and then as a young child, Mary frequently suffered injuries in household accidents in air quotes, because these occurred when she was alone with her mother Betty. It led her family to believe that either her mother was just negligent, just grossly negligent, or she was purposefully causing Mary's injuries. And even so far as to say, trying to kill her daughter. On one occasion, around 1960, so Mary would only have been 3 years old, Betty dropped Mary from a first floor window. So, attempts to kill Mary perhaps weren't so unfounded. On another occasion, she plied her daughter with sleeping pills, presumably to keep her quiet, maybe, while she was entertaining clients. But it's very, very dangerous, and that's just one occasion that we know of. She could have been doing that a lot. How easy would that have been for a child to be overdosed at such a young age? And get this one. This is according to one of her aunts. And obviously, the family were very concerned. And really, after the fact, they really got no reason to lie when they came out and told these stories. I don't think so anyway. But on one occasion, she actually sold Mary to a mentally unstable woman who was unable to have children of her own. And this resulted in one of Betty's sisters becoming so alarmed that she actually travelled to the other side of Newcastle where Mary was living, and reasoned with the woman and got Mary back. Now, I don't know about you, but perhaps, looking at it after the fact, that was a mistake. Maybe this woman would have looked after her far better than Betty, because as I said, the family wanted to take over her care, but Betty refused. Now, according to later accounts by Mary herself, once all this was over and she'd grown, Mary claims that her mother began to prostitute her out when she was only 4 years old. Now, this is uncorroborated by the family, but maybe, you know, those private moments inside the home were never known by the family. We just don't know what horrors Mary witnessed. And Betty, apparently, you know, wasn't just any old prostitute. She was into the sadomasochistic side of the profession. She was a dominatrix. You know, had Mary witnessed certain things going on that she later externalised and perhaps even normalised? Mary's young life, it was marked with loss. She saw her 5-year-old friend, and she was only 4 or 5 years old at the time. She saw her 5-year-old friend actually run over by a bus and killed. And some commentators say that this early loss, teamed with this real, very serious dysfunction and abuse, made Mary obsessed with death. And honestly, I think they're onto something, because both at home and at her school, which was Delaval Road Junior School, Mary exhibited numerous signs of disturbed and unpredictable behaviour, including sudden mood swings. She's known to have frequently fought with other children, both boys and girls, and she was indiscriminate. You know, once she had one of these mood swings and became violent, whoever was in her way copped for it, quite frankly. She'd even attempted to strangle some of her classmates, and the fact that she was doing this at school as well as in the privacy at home kind of leads me to believe that she really was very indiscriminate. She didn't care. It was like she was taken over by anger, and she didn't care who watched. She didn't care who noticed. On one occasion, this was at school, and how she wasn't expelled from school, I'll never know. But she's known to have attempted to block the windpipe, the trachea, of one of her classmates by filling her mouth with sand, which is utterly bizarre. How would such a little child know how to do such things is the key question. But this violent behaviour kind of outcast her, really. You know, these sudden mood swings, this violence, you know, they were scared of her. And classmates, after this kind of all came out, reported that they kind of knew when she was going to go into one of these angry episodes. She would kind of shake her head and form a steely glaze. It was like she was overtaken. She was just overtaken by anger. And to me, that sounds very much like Mary externalising the pain that she was experiencing at home, at the hands of her mother, perhaps at the hands of her father, perhaps at the hands of clients. But she was outcast by the children, you know, that were of her own age. So Mary would frequently be in the company of a girl called Norma Bell. Now, Norma was no relation that we know of Mary, even though they shared a surname. And she was a neighbour. She was 2 years older than Mary. She's no longer with us. She died in 1989. Now, it's believed, and it came out later at trial, that Norma had learning difficulties. So although Mary was 2 years younger than Norma, Mary was definitely the one of the pair that was in control. Norma, I guess, just followed Mary's lead. So this takes us to Saturday, 11th of May, 1968, when Mary was 10, she was almost 11. A 3-year-old boy in the local neighbourhood was wandering dazed and bleeding in the vicinity of St Margaret's Road, which was close to Mary's home. The child later informed police that he'd been playing with Mary and Norma on top of a disused air raid shelter. Because, you know, Newcastle at the time, there was kind of lots of really run-down areas. Even, you know, things hadn't been cleared up from the war, which ended in 1945. So, you know, there was disused air raid shelters, there was lots of building materials that hadn't been cleared away. And, you know, Mary didn't live in a nice part of town. But anyway, this little boy was found wandering along, and he said that one of the girls, and it is unclear which one, had pushed him 7 feet from the roof to the ground, inflicting severe lacerations to his head. The same evening, parents of 3 little girls came forward. They contacted the police to complain that both Mary and Norma had attempted to strangle their children. That evening, both Norma and Mary were interviewed by the police. Both girls denied any culpability. No, wasn't me, Gov. Wasn't me about these incidents. They claimed in relation to the 3-year-old boy that they'd actually found him. They'd actually found him wandering, and they had nothing to do with his injuries. And they certainly didn't push him 7 feet off an old air raid shelter. However, in relation to the 3 little girls, Norma admitted that Mary had tried to strangle them. And Norma claims that Mary had gone to one of the girls and said, "What happens if you choke someone? Do they die?" Then Mary put both of her hands around the girl's throat and squeezed. The girls started to go purple. Norma said she told Mary to stop, but she wouldn't. Then she put her hands round another girl's neck, and the 3rd girl the same. But eventually she did let them go. She didn't go through with it. Police notified the local authority, the social services, but due to the age of both of these girls, the police simply gave them a warning and let them go, and I guess left the situation in the hands of social services. That was a really, really bad move, because on the 25th of May, just one day before Mary's 11th birthday, Mary Bell strangled to death 4-year-old Martin Brown in an upstairs bedroom of a derelict house located at 85 St Margaret's Road, close to her home. She's believed to have committed this crime on her own. Norma wasn't there, but we don't really know. We don't really know, because Norma did turn up at the scene very shortly after. Now, these derelict houses were played in by local children, so it wasn't unusual for little kids to go and play there. And Brown's body was discovered quite quickly by other children who'd gone in to play. So the alarm was raised at about 3:30. These kids came out screaming. Apart from a few specks of blood and some foam around his mouth, there was no signs of violence. He just looked dead. Now, the screaming of these kids alerted a local workman who went in to the property and performed CPR on Martin Brown, but to no avail. He'd already passed. Now, this guy, John Hall, notified police that Mary and Norma Bell appeared in the doorway to the bedroom. Both were quickly shooed out. You know, this workman, John Hall, he just kind of thought, you know, it's more kids coming into play. He had no idea that Mary was the one who'd actually killed Martin Brown. Why would he even think that? But then Mary and Norma went and knocked on the door of one of Martin's aunts and said, "Your sister's kid has just had an accident. We think it's Martin, but we can't tell because there's so much blood over him." So that was a lie, because Martin had no blood, a little bit around his mouth. But what was found was a bottle of tablets, painkillers, next to Martin. So I'm guessing that had been planted there to make it look like a poisoning. The following day, Dr. Bernard Knight conducted an autopsy on the body of Martin Brown and was unable to find any signs of violence on the child's body. This little boy just looked like he'd laid down and died. And also, he hadn't been poisoned. So, at an inquest on the 7th of June, 1968, the coroner stated an open verdict. They just didn't know what had killed or who had killed Martin Brown. But Martin's grieving family might have started to suspect Mary, because days after Martin's death, Mary showed up at Martin's home, and she asked to see him. Now, I guess because she's such a little girl, and, you know, Martin's mother was grieving, she thought that Mary didn't know that Martin was dead. And she gently explained to Mary that Martin had died. But Mary said she already knew that. She actually wanted to see his body in the coffin. Martin's mother was horrified and slammed the door in her face. Now, interestingly, shortly after this, like a day or two after, Mary and Norma broke into a local nursery school, vandalised it, and wrote notes. Apparently there was 4 notes, taking responsibility for Martin's death, saying that they'd murdered him. Police assumed that the notes were a hoax, a cruel, horrible hoax. But they were written in very childlike writing. But yeah, police were just utterly mystified until the 31st of July 1968, when a 3-year-old boy named Brian Howe was last seen by his parents in the street outside his house, again close to Norma and Mary Bell's homes. He was playing with his siblings, the family dog, who was called Lassie, and Mary and Norma Bell. But when he didn't return home later that afternoon, concerned relatives and neighbours searched the streets without success. And it was only at 11:10 p.m, when, you know, search parties had been out for several hours, Brian's body was discovered kind of lying between 2 large concrete blocks, you know, like leftover building materials and things. The first police officer to arrive at the scene observed that a deliberate but feeble attempt had been made to cover up the body with clumps of grass and weeds. He had bruises and scratches on his neck, and there was a pair of broken scissors close by his feet. The coroner concluded that Brian had died of strangulation and that he'd been deceased for up to 7 to 8 hours before the discovery of his body. So around the time when he was playing there with Mary and Norma Bell. The coroner ascertained that the killer had evidently squeezed Brian's nostrils closed. There was bruising around his nostrils, and gripped his throat with the other hand. Numerous puncture wounds had been inflicted to the child's legs before death. Sections of his hair had been cut, sections of his body had been mutilated, and it was thought that the killer had tried to kind of like scratch the letter M, into his body. But because there was, you know, a relatively small amount of force applied to the neck, the coroner rightly guessed that the killer was possibly a child. Also, numerous grey and maroon fibres were discovered on Brian's clothing and on his shoes. And these fibres did not come from Brian's clothing. Different colour, different types of fibres. And they also checked the clothing from the Howe's home, like the parents' clothes, and the fibres weren't a match for those either. So clearly a very rigorous search had taken place over Brian's death, because, you know, this was the second very unusual death in only a couple of months. So the police were starting to get very scared that actually there was a murderer afoot. This started a large-scale manhunt, but not the usual type of manhunt, because who they were interviewing was children. Over 100 detectives from all across the region of Northumberland, were assigned to the investigation. And within only a few days, over 1,000 children have been questioned in regard to their whereabouts on the 31st of July. 2 children questioned were Mary and Norma Bell. Witnesses had already informed investigators that they'd been with Brian shortly before his death. In her initial interview with the police, Norma seemed excitable, thrilled even, to be being interviewed by the police over something so serious. But Mary was much more calm. She observed everything. She questioned the police. Not excitable like the childish Norma. They admitted to playing with Brian, but knowing nothing about his death. Police were very suspicious of Mary. Mary's demeanour really alarmed them. So the day after, she was questioned again, and she changed her story. This time, she said that she'd seen an 8-year-old local boy playing with Brian on the afternoon of the 31st of July, and that she'd seen him hitting the child. She also remembered the boys had been covered in grass and weeds, as if they'd been rolling in a field, and that in this 8-year-old boy's possession was a pair of broken scissors. This was a self-incriminating statement because only the police officers on the case knew about the broken scissors. That detail had not been released to the public. So they knew at least Mary was there. It put her right at the scene. And the boy that she implicated hadn't been in the area at the time. He was actually at Newcastle airport, and witnesses could corroborate that he was there. So on the afternoon of the 4th of August, the parents of Norma Bell contacted the police, stating that their daughter wished to confess what she knew about the death of Brian Howe. Detective Inspector Dobson arrived at the home, formally cautioned Norma, and then asked what she knew. Norma informed Dobson that Mary had taken her to the spot, at which point she'd been shown Brian's dead body. Mary had demonstrated to her how she'd strangled the child. According to Norma, Mary had confessed to her that she enjoyed strangling the child, and described how Mary had inflicted the marks with razor blades and those broken scissors on Brian's body. She also revealed the place where this razor blade that the police didn't know about was hidden. They knew Norma had been there. She was able to draw exactly where on his body some of the bruising was. So then Mary Bell was visited at her home in the early hours of the 5th of August. She was notably defensive. That calm demeanour had gone. She was confrontational. She was angry. And she didn't like the fact that she was being disbelieved. She said to detectives, "You're trying to brainwash me. I will get a solicitor to get me out of this." Forensic examination of the clothing owned by both girls revealed that the grey fibres discovered on Brian's body were a precise match to the woolen dress owned by Mary Bell that she'd worn on that day, the 31st of July. And the maroon fibres on the child's shoes were a match to the skirt owned by Norma. Furthermore, the same grey fibres had been found, interestingly, they went back to check, had been found on the body of Martin Brown. Brian Howe was buried. His funeral took place on the 7th of August in a ceremony that was attended by over 200 very, very grieving people. DCI Dobson noted that Mary stood outside the Howe household as the child's coffin was brought from the home at the beginning of the funeral procession. Detective Dobson later stated she stood there laughing and rubbing her hands. I thought, my God, I've got to bring her in. She'll do another one. So both girls, Mary and Norma, were formally charged with the murder of Brian Howe at 8 p.m. that evening, 7th of August. In response to this charge, Mary replied, "That's all right for me." What? Norma burst into tears though and said, "I never did it." She was freaking out. In the presence of an independent witness, Mary prepared a written statement in which she admitted to being present when Brian Howe was murdered. But she insisted now that it was Norma who committed the murder. She also admitted that she and Norma had broken into the nursery school days after Martin Brown's death. So she admitted some things, but then implicated Norma in the most serious thing, that of murder. Shortly after the arrest, both girls underwent detailed psychological evaluations, and the result of these tests revealed that Norma was intellectually delayed. She was She was a girl that had learning difficulties. She easily displayed emotion. She easily, cried. And she had somewhat of a gullible nature, shall we say. Whereas Mary was bright, cunning, manipulative. She would talk when she wanted to. But then she rapidly became bored and her mood changed and she became defensive. The evaluations took place by 4 different psychiatrists who examined Mary and concluded that although she wasn't suffering from a mental disorder like depression or anxiety or bipolar, what she was suffering from was psychopathy. Each of the 4 psychiatrists said that 11-year-old Mary Bell was a psychopath. In an official report compiled for the Director of Public Prosecutions, Dr. David Westbury, one of the psychiatrists, concluded, Mary's social techniques are primitive and take the form of denial, manipulation, complaining, bullying, flight or violence. So to the trial. The trial began Newcastle on the 5th of December 1968. And they were tried for the murders of both Martin Brown and Brian Howe. Both girls were tried before Justice Ralph Cusack, and both pled not guilty to the charges. The trial lasted 9 days, and on the 17th of December, the jury retired to consider their verdict on both girls. After 3 hours and 25 minutes, they'd reached their verdict. Mary Bell was cleared of murder. See, the judge had instructed that the jury could find Mary and Norma guilty of murder or of manslaughter due to diminished responsibilities due to their age, or to obviously acquit them. So Mary was found guilty of manslaughter by grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma, on the other hand, was completely acquitted of all charges. Upon hearing the jury's verdict, Norma clapped her hands with excitement, whereas Mary burst into tears, and her mother and grandmother, who were in the public gallery, also wept. Judge Cusack described Mary as a dangerous individual, adding that she posed a grave risk to other children and that steps must be taken to protect the public from her. She was sentenced to be detained effectively. Well, it was an indefinite sentence. In June 1979, so 11 years later, the Home Office announced the decision to transfer Mary Bell to an open prison, HM Prison Askham Grange. And what they wanted to do was rehabilitate Mary. She was now 22 years old. She was grown. They were going to attempt to release her and integrate her back into society. So it was an open prison, so she was allowed out at certain times, and she was given a job as a waitress at a cafe in York Minster in the city of York. Obviously under supervision, but this was to prepare her for an eventual release. And she was released. She was released on licence at the age of 23 in 1980, having served almost 11 and a half years in custody. Now, something that absolutely angered the victims' families, and perhaps rightly so, she was granted lifelong anonymity, a new name, and the means to start a new life elsewhere in the country. It's interesting that 4 years after her release, in 1984, she gave birth to a daughter on the 25th of May. The 25th of May is the anniversary of Martin Brown's death. That is a twist of fate, a peculiar twist of fate. Obviously, Mary couldn't have controlled when her baby was born, but just weird. The daughter was her only child, and this daughter was 14 by the time she discovered what her mother had done at the age of 11. And that was when investigative reporters found Mary's location. And it was down on the Sussex coast, so a long way away from her birth town of Newcastle. So to abide by the lifelong protection that the Home Office had given Mary, and also any offspring of Mary were granted the same anonymity. So they were rehoused in a safe house by undercover officers, and both mother and daughter eventually were relocated to another part of the UK, and that's where Mary's story ends. It seems that her anonymity has been maintained, but allegedly she's now a grandmother. And there we end the story. I find it shocking, I find it disturbing, but at the same time I have some sense of sympathy. It's no excuse for what she did, of course, no excuse whatsoever, but what I think she was doing was externalising the pain and playing out the things that perhaps she'd been witnessing. And this obsession with death, I think in some ways, was a defence mechanism in some way, shape or form against the pain that she was feeling. It was almost like a fantasy life, and at certain times she just could not control that anger. I don't know, it's a very sad story for all concerned. But of course my heart goes out to the families of Martin and Brian, whose children's lives were snuffed out by a troubled little girl. It shouldn't have happened. It should not have happened. All the warning signs were there. They were there. And if only someone, anyone, had acted sooner, Martin and Brian would not have died. They would not have lost their lives. So I'm going to call it a day here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I've been Michelle. I hope you're doing well. I'll see you in the next video. The next video will be over on my main channel, Michelle After Dark. I'll see you soon. Goodbye from Miss Cassie Springer and Miss Tillington, who've also got YouTube channels. They don't post very often. They post little snippets of things that they do, little funny things. But I'll see you very soon. Bye, folks.